All right, so where we are. Now there's another thing. There's a mystery about what's supposed to happen next week. So I'm just going to ignore what the university says and proceed as I always do in the last week, and that means the following. I will try not to introduce any new material, but I will try to review the material that we've already been over for the sake of the final exam. So you'll have some, so it will help you prepare for the final exam if I review material. I won't promise not to say anything new, but I'll try not to say anything new. Part of the problem is I don't remember what I've said so far, but in any case, next week will be for purposes of review. Now, what I'd like you to do next week when you come to class is bring this thing with all these questions. And I don't guarantee that any of these questions will be on the final exam, but I will make a prediction. If you can answer all of these questions with no problem, if you just feel completely on top of all this material, and you really are on top, you won't have too much trouble with the final exam. That's a prediction. If you're on top of all this material, the final exam shouldn't be too much trouble. And I'll tell you something else. If the exam is intelligently designed and you're prepared, it ought to be fun. Taking the final exam ought to be fun. You get a chance to put all the material together and show your stuff, and I'll explain why the professor is wrong or whatever. So you should get, and again, I probably told you this already, but let me repeat. The things I look for on a final exam and the things I ask my colleagues to look for are, one, does the person answer the question? And you'd be surprised how often the person fails to answer the question. So he sees a word that looks familiar. Searle. Oh yeah, he remembers that. And he's got a whole lot of things in his notes that surround that name. So he writes everything he can remember from his notes. That wasn't the question. You see, think of the poor examiner. You're trying to think of a question, and your feelings are hurt if the person doesn't take the question seriously. So one, try to answer the question. Two, know your stuff. It's nice if you actually learn something. We have the illusion that you're going to be different as a result of having taken the course. You're going to have information and ideas you wouldn't have otherwise have had. Three, can the person think philosophically for himself or herself? If the exam is intelligently designed, there should be some questions that will give you a chance to show some original thinking on your own part. And four, it is an enormous help if you can write English sentences. I long ago gave up on paragraphs, but sentences are much appreciated. Now, I'd also like to say, show good penmanship, but I have the world's worst penmanship myself, so I'm embarrassed to ask you to write legibly. I haven't written legibly since the third grade, and the truth is, I wasn't very legible even in the third grade. So those are the things that I look for. My all-time favorite was a student I had who produced a 3-hour examination without a single grammatical English sentence. And I was sorry I didn't save the exam. And when I pointed this out to him, he wanted to go to graduate school, and the C- didn't help him. He said, this is the first time in Berkeley, he was a graduating senior, that anybody had ever asked him to write English sentences on an exam. He was a chemistry major, and they had no English sentences in chemistry. Well, anyway, that's how it goes. Such is life. Jennifer.
Question 36 is ambiguous.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, well, we can't have that. Strike it out. Yeah, okay. War is a speech act. I haven't said that in class, so let me say it now.
No, it's just the way it's written, it's ambiguous.
War is a speech act?
War is a speech act.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's two interpretations of this.
Okay, what are the interpretations?
Well, we'll talk about
Okay, all right. She's going to teach me about this. I haven't discussed social conflict very much, but it's very important to understand that war, whatever else it is a type of speech act. You're trying to convince your enemy you've lost. Or there are variations on that. In the Vietnamese War, the Vietnamese convinced us not you've lost, but rather you can't win at a price that you would be willing to pay. You didn't actually lose. We're not going to conquer Washington. We're not even going to occupy San Francisco. But a speech act finally got across. The coin dropped in Washington, D.C. Yes?
But what about the statement, war is a speech act?
Yeah.
That's the statement.
Yeah, it's a statement. Right, discuss the statement.
She wants you to lose the quotation marks. I want you to lose the
Oh, I see. Oh, were there quotation marks around war?
It's ambiguous. The whole thing.
Or is it a speech act? No, discuss the statement.
No, it's wrong.
It's not. It's not ambiguous. It says there is a statement that war is a speech act. I want you to discuss that statement.
The very statement.
Yeah, the very statement.
Just not
Yeah.
the whole notion of war.
Well, no. The statement makes a claim, and the claim is that war is a speech act, and that I think it is. You see, this is why the war in the Pacific was different from the war in the Atlantic. The Germans had a long tradition of victory and defeat. And so the concept of defeat was intelligible. It was expensive, but it was intelligible. The Japanese had no tradition whatever of defeat. They had 3,000 years, literally, without a military defeat, and they had a certain mythology. The mythology was that we lose all the battles except the last one. And most Americans don't know what harakiri means. They think it means some kind of nutty pilot who crashes his plane. It doesn't mean that. It means a divine wind. And that's what has always rescued the Japanese, beginning with the war against the Koreans, when the divine wind blew the Korean ships out of the water. And they had, people think, well, we had already won the war by 1945. No, we had not. We beat their Navy and their Air Force, but their army was 10 million strong waiting for us. And it was very hard to get the Speech Act across. Unfortunately, we had a device that literally saved millions of lives, and that was the atomic bomb. That was completed the Speech Act. They got the message. There's a very good book about this, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you should look at it. It's by a guy named Richard Frank, and it is the best book that I have read about the end of the war in the Pacific. It's called Downfall. And so you should have a look at that book. Now also, I promised to do something, and I probably haven't done it, and that is look up a crucial item in your education. And let's see if I can remember. Kaga, Ikagu, Ikagu, and Hiryu. And now they spell it differently, but something like Soryu. Those are the 4 aircraft carriers sank at Midway, and they changed the course of world history. Up to that point, nobody had beaten the Japanese from 1930 on, and after this point, they had no successes. After this point, at Leyte Gulf and everywhere else, they lost. So this was the turning point of the war and the turning point of history. Now you might say, well, it wasn't all on the 4th of June. This guy wasn't actually sunk until the next day. Okay, I agree with that. I mean, but these are minor points. You had your hand up.
Don't we talk on details for the word kamikaze?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What did I say? Oh, yeah. Kamikaze, of course. Well, there you are. Kamikaze is the word I was groping for. Kamikaze names not a type of pilot, but it names the divine wind. Yeah, that's, as they say, a slip of the tongue. Well, you know, my Japanese was never very strong. Okay, shall we go on then with, yeah.
I have a question about the Speech Act. So you're saying it's an assertive and the content is you've lost?
Yes. What we're trying to convey is you've lost.
Okay, but why not say it's an expressive, I don't like what you're doing?
Well, because there are ways of expressing, you know, I don't like what you're doing, short of war, and they don't produce things like unconditional surrender. You see, the concept of unconditional surrender is one of those hopelessly confused concepts. Strictly speaking, there is no such thing as unconditional surrender. People surrender on the basis of certain assumptions. If the Germans had thought that we were going to do to them what they did to the Jews, they would not have surrendered. So they surrendered on the basis of certain assumptions. Now, it's very interesting to see the terms on which the Japanese were willing to surrender, and they were hopelessly unrealistic. I mean, interesting thing is, since it's a tiny number of people involved, it wasn't, you know, there was massive public opinion in action in Japan. There was not. It's a tiny number of people involved. And until the atomic bomb, they had a hopelessly inaccurate conception of their military situation. And the idea was to get across to them, you've lost. You can surrender with honor because you were defeated militarily, And that's not an easy thing to explain to that background. But the form in which the military defeat was conveyed was not your army was beaten by our army in the field, but we had a scientific device that you guys didn't have. You were beaten by our science, not by a failure of your fighting spirit, which they thought was the deciding factor in any war. Okay, I don't know quite how we got off onto this, but it is important. And in other times I've taught this course, I spent more time on that particular statement. Yes?
But so in this case, this one won't be successful until it's had the perlocutionary
That's right,
effect.
yeah.
You can't
Yeah, war is a speech act that is aimed at a perlocutionary effect. You're trying to convince your enemy of something. You're trying to convince them that they have lost. Their enemies vary in the degree of difficulty conveying that. The Japanese were the hardest you can imagine because they had no tradition of defeat. The Germans, okay, so you win some, you lose some. But with the Japanese, they never lost any, and they thought they had, so to speak, God on their side. They had they had the divine wind that would come to their rescue. Okay, any other questions about this stuff? Yes?
How many questions do we have to answer for the final exam?
Well, why don't I think of that next week? I haven't drafted the final, and I'm not going to do it without consulting. Here's how I like to do it. There should be a choice. You should have a range of questions you can answer, and the exam should be divided into sections that more or less mask the organization of the course, that match the organization of the course in such a way that there'll be a section on your understanding of social ontology, another section on your understanding of the nature of social explanation, the distinction between Verstehen and Erklären, all that kind of stuff, which is part of textbooks accounts of social philosophy and a philosophy of social explanation. So there will, none of this is a promise, but next week we'll go into this in more detail. There will be, in general, when I do these exams, there's a division into different topics. Okay, other questions about this? Yeah. I can't hear you.
What if there are some war the aim of which is extinct?
Yeah, okay. A civilized warfare is a speech act. There are forms of warfare that are straight genocide, where the purpose is to exterminate people on the other side. And there's no question that there have been wars like that. Indeed, there is no adequate history of the military operations of the United States against the American Indians. But in some cases, it seems to me the aim was something like genocide. Now, it'd be interesting to see the history of the whole Western Hemisphere. When I taught in Brazil, I went to Brazil thinking, well, Brazil is a country that seems to have solved its racial problems. Not true. On the contrary, there's no question but what black people and the native Brazilians occupied an inferior social status. As a professor in Brazil, I had no black students at all, even though a sizable percentage of the population were non-white. And I had all of my students were white, and that seemed to be the case with the university. Now, however, they survived. In Argentina, it's more interesting, or maybe less interesting. As far as I can tell, something like genocide took place in Argentina. And what they did was simply recreate Europe. If you want to see what Paris looked like 50 years ago, go to BA, go to Buenos Aires. The women are dressed like Paris of a long time ago. I know, I haven't been there in a few years, but when I was last there, I was struck by, you're stepping back in time, they're imitating a certain European style of life, and they say, the Peruvians are descended from the Incas, and the Mexicans are descended from the Aztecs, but we Argentinians are descended from boats. They came out of the boats and killed everybody in sight. Now, I hesitate to say that because I haven't done a serious study, but that was my impression traveling around Argentina, is that they did not leave much of the natives intact, and somebody should track this down and do some research on it. So there are cases like that where it is genocidal. On my account, the Nazis' treatment of the Jews was not a case of warfare. It was a case of a straight genocide, or at least that was the aim. And not just the Jews, but various kinds of Untermenschen, They had the same attitude towards Slavs and Gypsies that they had toward the Jews. It's just there were too many. They couldn't kill them all. What? No, genocide is not a speech act because there's no communicative intent. You see, if I just kill you, then it's not a speech act. But if I try to get you to persuade you to give me your money or something like that, then I'm trying to communicate something to you, typically by threatening you. Okay, any other questions? I want to go on with the topics from last time. Now, last time I finished talking about rights, but there's some things I didn't tell you that are crucial, and that is it's essential to understand that the notion of rights has certain logical properties, and in popular speech these are commonly misunderstood. I mentioned before that in the United States there's a peculiar rhetorical device whereby you can short-circuit discussion of rights simply by citing the constitutional provision in question. So why should we have free speech? It's in the First Amendment. Why is slavery evil? Because it's outlawed by the 13th Amendment, and so on. So Americans will stop discussing a question of right when you cite the constitutional provision, but that's not philosophically acceptable. We have to be able to justify all of these rights. Okay, but there are certain standard mistakes, and I especially encountered these in the free speech movement and afterwards in the 60s. And one was the idea that, well, things like the right to free speech are not absolute. What is that supposed to mean? Well, I think there is a distinction to be made between what I call absolute rights and conditional rights. The right to life and the right to free speech are absolute because they're not conditional on your occupying a certain kind of institutional or other sort of status. Whereas, for example, my right to cross-examine witnesses is conditional on my being in a court case and people are testifying against me. So if people are saying nasty things about me on Searle Plaza, I have no right to cross-examine them. That's not a part of the right of cross-examination of witnesses. But my right to free speech is not like that. It's not dependent on my being in some other institutional structure. Now there's another related point, and that is people often think that if a right is overridden by some other consideration, then it follows that the right in question was only a prima facie right. So you get three different kinds of rights on this account: absolute rights, conditional rights, and prima facie rights. This notion of prima facie is a source of massive confusion, and I want to clarify it now. The confusion was due to Sir David Ross, who published in 1926 an article on prima facie obligations. And he was struck by the following: if I am under an obligation to go to your party because I made a promise to you, and I'm on the way to your party and I see a man dying in the street, then I have to abandon my obligation to go to your party to save the life of the person dying in the street. So far, so good. But then Ross said, so my obligation to you was only a prima facie obligation. That's wrong. It was an absolute, straight-out obligation. It's just that it was overridden by another obligation, my obligation to save this person's life. Now, for some reason, it's very hard for people in our intellectual culture to recognize that there can be conflicting, valid, absolute reasons for doing something. I have a valid reason for going to your party. It's not conditional or prima facie. And I have a valid reason for saving the person's life and not going to your party. And these are just in conflict. The existence of conflicting obligations is not a mystery. It's absolutely standard. You have conflicting reasons for doing something, and it does not invalidate any of the reasons to show that they can be overridden by other reasons. That you often have a reason for doing something which runs against some other valid reason. The mistake is to suppose, well, that shows that one of the reasons wasn't an honest to John, all-out, unconditional, absolute reason, but it was only a prima facie reason, a kind of a shadow of a reason. I'll take a question in a second. Prima facie in the law is a sentence modifier. To say there's a prima facie case is to say on the face of it. That's what prima facie means. On the face of it, there is evidence to suppose that. So if you're in this country without a passport and you're a foreign citizen, then prima facie, there's a prima facie case that you're in the country illegally. That means that there's some reason to suppose. But that is not the kind of consideration we're considering here. My obligation to go to your party is not a prima facie obligation. It's an absolute unconditional obligation. It just happens to conflict with other obligations and other reasons. Why do we find that so uncomfortable? And I think the reason is it looks like it violates the law of non-contradiction. It looks like it can't both be the case that I have an absolute obligation to go to your party and an absolute obligation not to go to your party. I think that that's exactly the right way to describe it. But the reason we find that uncomfortable is that we think that it's like saying it is the case that P and not P. Now, you all have the resources for seeing what's going on here. It's direction of fit. If you have a representation with this direction of fit, with the word-to-world direction of fit, then it cannot both be true and its negation be true. You cannot both have the proposition that P and the proposition that not P. So you get P, not both the case that P and not P. This is the law of non-contradiction. But when it comes to things like obligation, there's nothing wrong with it being both the case that you ought to do P and you ought to do not P. Those are perfectly possible situations. Indeed, it's part of real life. Why? Why is that possible? Because this has the other direction of fit. That is, the obligation is fulfilled only if the world changes to match the content of the obligations. This is true of representations generally. It's perfectly legally, rationally possible to have inconsistent desires. In fact, I don't think you can live your life without having inconsistent desires, but it's not okay to have inconsistent beliefs. Why? Well, because desire has this direction of fit. The world is supposed to change to match the contents of the mind, and beliefs have this downhill direction of fit, and you cannot consistently and knowingly have inconsistent beliefs, but you can consistently and knowingly have inconsistent desires. Indeed, I want to say it's inevitable. But we find this difficult in moral philosophy. Traditionally, this has been difficult for people to stomach. They just can't think, how can it be both the case that I ought to do this and I ought not to do that? And the answer is you ought to do it relative to one set of reasons. You made a promise. And you ought not to do it relative to another set of reasons. You need to break your promise in order to save somebody's life. So what Ross did and what whole generations of moral philosophers have done is fudge and say, well, there was something wrong with the obligation. It wasn't an honest to John unconditional obligation. It was only prima facie. That's a mistake. The obligation can be absolute, unconditional, and still be overridden by other considerations. Okay. Now, there's another mistake that's related to that, and that is that people suppose that if you have a right that is overridden by utilitarian considerations, you have the right to free speech, but if you exercise it on this occasion, there's going to be mass deaths. There's going to be some clear and present danger that people are going to die in large numbers. Then we override your right to free speech on utilitarian grounds. Now they suppose, well, that shows that your right to free speech was a utilitarian right all along, that it was justified by utilitarian considerations. That doesn't follow. The fact that a deontic right, a non-utilitarian right, can be overridden by utilitarian considerations. Everybody understands this jargon. Utilitarian means consequentialist. What are the consequences of the exercise of the right? The fact that the right can be overridden by utilitarian or consequentialist considerations does not imply that the right itself was a utilitarian right, that your right to free speech is really the right to exercise free speech, provided that there's a utilitarian advantage to doing so. That's just a mistake. Okay, so I made 3 strong claims, and you'd be surprised how common these mistakes are. The mistake of supposing that if a right can be overridden by another right, it follows that it wasn't absolute but conditional. No, there can be conflicts between unconditional or absolute rights, and indeed it's a confusion to confuse the absolute right to free speech with the conditional right to cross-examine witnesses. An even greater confusion is to suppose that whenever a reason is overridden, such as a right, it follows that the reason or the right was only prima facie. And that's worse than a confusion, because it's a logical confusion. Prima facie is an epistemic sentence modifier. It doesn't name a type of right. It names an evidentiary status to sentences. And then the third point is that the fact that utilitarian considerations can overcome or override reasons for action doesn't imply that the reasons were utilitarian to start with. Okay, with that, that's a summary. Now let's take questions. You had your hand up. Yeah.
Is there some, are you getting to some logical way of arbitrating between 2 absolute obligations?
No, I don't think there can be an algorithm. So let's say a little bit about that. It often happens that you have to adjudicate between conflicting rights. I have a right to free speech, you have a right to life. Therefore, my right to free speech ought to be overridden by your right to life. Why? Well, because right to life is more important. You lose all your rights if you die. I don't lose my rights if I don't get to exercise my free speech on this occasion. But the mistake is, so it's kind of an obvious case. The mistake is to think, well, there ought to be an algorithm. There ought to be an algorithm for adjudicating between conflicting reasons for action, and there can't be. I don't see how there could be an algorithm, because any algorithm you would state would already be subject to precisely this sort of conflicts. But once again, it runs against our intellectual culture to suppose there can be rational means of settling disputes which are non-algorithmic. Where you can't let it be done by a computer, where you have to exercise this dreadful capacity of judgment. You just have to be able to make a good judgment. So that's a deep question, and it is part of our intellectual culture. We think if it's rational, it ought to be algorithmic. And it's very hard for us to overcome that, but we need to overcome it. There are all kinds of things that are perfectly rational but non-algorithmic. Yes? Okay.
Because in that way it's conditional obligation without being prima facie, so it's not absolute. But it
Okay. Now this is again a very deep urge, and I know that it's a deep urge because Jack Rawls, who was a very good philosopher, this word is supposed to be changes here. Even I can't read it. Jack said, if you have a case where your obligation to keep a promise is overridden by some sort of consideration, then that forces you to change the concept of promising. It forces you to a changed notion of obligation. Not so. You have raised another deep question that relates to his question, and that is the notion of other things being equal. Other things being equal, I have to keep my promises. But what does it mean to say other things are equal? Well, it makes it look as if it's a condition. Isn't there a condition like the condition of being in a court case? So on the condition that I'm in a court case, that I'm the defendant in a trial, I have a right to cross-examine witnesses. And on the condition that ceteris paribus just means other things being equal, but it sounds more official because it's in Latin. You know, it sounds like you know what you're talking about. You don't. It just means other things equal. But I don't think that's the case. What it means is, and now I have to introduce another confused notion, but I think it's useful here, and that is, in general, statements that give reasons for action with this direction of fit. You're under an obligation. It ought to be the case. They are defeasible. That is, there are kinds of rational considerations that you can state which will succeed in defeating them, that will overcome them. But it doesn't follow from that, from the fact that they're defeasible, that therefore they were really disguised conditionals. That you get an undefeasible statement of obligation simply by putting it in the conditional form. If other things are equal, then you have an obligation to do such and so. Now, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying, well, that's a condition like any other? And the answer is, by its very nature, it's vague. It's supposed to be vague because you can't say in advance what sorts of considerations are going to arise. You can't say in advance what constitutes other things being equal. And again, the really deep aspect of this is about direction of fit. And the deep aspect of direction of fit is the difference between two different parts of our nervous system, the motor nervous system and the sensory nervous system, one of whose job is to tell you how things are in the world, and that's this direction of fit, and the other whose job is to enable you to navigate in the world, and that's the other direction of fit. I'm sorry to give you such a vague and unsatisfactory answer, but this is where a course in ethics and that kind of stuff, may God protect me from never having to teach again a course in ethics, because I think the whole subject is very confused, but I have done it. I mean, none of you were born last time I taught a course in ethics, and if this were a course in, well, one or two of you were born, but I would explain that in more detail, how rationality allows for conflicting reasons, and when we say that you have an obligation or you ought to do something, in general, those are defeasible. They are other things being equal, or unless something unforeseen arises, or something like that. And that looks intellectually unsatisfying because at some deep level, it's the Descartes in us coming out. We want an algorithm. We want it to be precisely and mathematically statable, and it isn't. Okay, a question, and I apologize for the obscurity of the answer. Yes?
So rights are not grounded on utilitarian grounds. So what grounds it?
Okay.
Rights exactly? Is it biology and
okay,
like
so this is a very good question, and I've answered it briefly, but let me state the answer again. If the right is not grounded on utilitarian grounds, and it's embarrassing to me that people like John Stuart Mill's justification of free speech are still cited as if they were intellectually respectable. They are not. But if they're not justifiable on utilitarian grounds, then what is the justification? And I said that you really couldn't do it except by stating two sorts of principles, that both of which are regarded as somehow doubtful. I mean, some people think it's intellectually not respectable. One, you must have a theory of human beings, how human beings flourish, what it means to be a human being, and how human beings can flourish. And I say that ultimately that has to be a biological notion. It is because we are speech act performing animals that there should be a right to free speech. But that's not sufficient just to say that we're speech act performing animals. We are. I think it's part of our nature that we like to talk. If you had a life which you could not express yourself at all, it would be a very frustrating and unsatisfactory life. We're talking beasts. Okay, but the second thing is that you have to have an axiology. And again, that's one of those words that makes it sound like you know what you're talking about when you don't really. It just means you have to have a set of values. You have to have a conception of what's valuable and what isn't valuable. As I mentioned before, there are all sorts of inclinations that people have that are biologically based, but seem to me do not ground rights. If there's one thing we know about adolescent males, they have a basic biological urge to beat up on other adolescent males. I speak as a survivor of an American high school. I hope none of you have ever been through this experience, but I have. But that doesn't give them a right. Why not? Well, basically, the beating up bit violates other people's rights in a way that free speech does not. And this is the crucial point, in addition to a theory of human nature, you've got to have a theory of what's valuable. And I think, that expressing yourself is valuable. Even if what you say is confused, muddled, incoherent, even if it's deconstructionist, postmodernist, think of the worst nonsense you can think of, you still have a right. We're still better off if you're able to exercise your right to talk nonsense, because there is a value in expressing yourself. So there are two parts to the justification of human rights. You have to have a theory of human nature. That's now regarded as kind of illegitimate. Why? Because, well, in the 18th century, it was corrupted in various ways. But if you break away from the tradition and just think about, well, what sorts of beasts are we? Then I think we can give you an account of human nature. We're social, we're naturally group forming, and we are speech act performing. And then secondly, you've got to have a theory of what's valuable in human nature and what isn't valuable. Now, that makes it look arbitrary. I can give you grounds for saying that this is valuable and this is not valuable. But again, it's not an algorithm. It's not like reporting. It's not like something that has this direction of fit where you're just reporting a set of facts. No, on the contrary, you are stating a set of claims about what ought to be the case. Yes?
Are there rights that do have utilitarian grounds, perhaps in addition to other grounds, but say administrative rights, like somebody has the right to...
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, no. I'm talking now about universal human rights. I mean, the rights of the department chairman, I think, are, if they're justifiable at all, are justifiable on a consequentialist administrative grounds. The university works better if such and such boring things are done by the department chairman. I don't. The claims I'm making now are not about administrative bureaucracies, but about universal human rights. Go say some more.
I guess that just seems like there's an element of utilitarianism in any statement that says that free speech allows humans to flourish, and that's why we have it, because that flourishing.
Yeah. Okay. But you see, the difficulty with a utilitarian statement of human rights is that then when the utilitarian considerations are not present, then you're entitled to abrogate the rights. So the problem with Mill's account is Mill says, look, we're all better off if people have the right to free speech, even if what they say is false. And then he has these various feeble arguments to the effect that, well, it's only because of our awareness of the falsehoods that we can appreciate the truth. Remember all this? It's been a long time since I read On Liberty, but this is the kind of stuff that he argues. But then it seems to me there will be cases when it's obvious, when you can establish that there is no utilitarian payoff to people being able to state these false propositions. On the contrary, the utilities are negative utilities. All the same, they still have a right. So yeah, let me put this in one sentence. If the justification of the right is utilitarian, then in instance where the utilitarian considerations go against the exercise of the right, you would lose the right. I mean, for reasons you gave us earlier. Namely, if the justification of the right is utilitarian, it becomes conditional. On the assumption that there are these utilitarian advantages to the exercise of the right, you have the right. And that's the position that I'm rejecting. Say some more.
I guess this relates a lot back to what you were saying before about conditional rights then, because it seems like the times when utilitarian justification doesn't apply and that there be negative utilities to exercise those rights, those times seem like the times that we allow the rights to be overridden by other considerations.
Yes, but they better be pretty extreme. You see, okay, and now we can give you some general principles for overriding the right. Just the fact that it's negative utility, that's not enough to override the right to free speech. Right. Let me give you an argument that I frequently hear. It's very common. It goes as follows. There are some people who think that speech is a type of action. I'm one of them. And if that's right, then speech ought to be regulated like any other type of action. We don't allow people to go around hitting each other. That's an action. So why do we allow them to go around saying things that are politically incorrect? That's another type of action. And I have an answer to that. The answer is because the effects of being hit are not up to the receiver in the way that the effect of being argued at is up to the receiver. I mean, it's the old children's adage about sticks and stones. People can say all kinds of silly things, and they may annoy me, exasperate me, they might even make me lose sleep, but all the same, it's up to me. So, though I think that there's probably never been a time in history when so much nonsense was taught, well, I don't want to say that, no. Yeah, there have been some spectacular nonsense periods, but there's a great deal of nonsense talk now. But the fact that there's a negative utility in the nonsense doesn't deprive the people talking the nonsense of the right to talk it. Yes?
It seems like to establish these geometries, you need an axiology that is like direction, something that's like
Well, now you're asking me another question, and that is the question: what is the basis of morality? And this isn't the course for that. Okay, if I can solve the problem of social ontology, that's all you get in this course. We don't. I mean, I've written stuff about that. I wrote a chapter of a book I'm supposed to write, and the chapter is called, what's the chapter called? It's about ethics, and it's the foundations of ethics. And this is one of the points at issue. But there's no swift answer to that. You know, there are two famous swift absolute answers that are supposed to provide objectivity to ethics. One is utilitarianism, that says it's ethical if it leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And we know that's easy to refute. Any freshman can refute that. I mean, the famous refutation is if you get enough sadists enjoying torturing a single individual, then eventually their pleasure in sadism overcomes his negative utility in being tortured. Well, it's a reductio ad absurdum. Okay. But the other option is Kant. And Kant says, no, it's moral if it satisfies the categorical imperative. Now, that's an interesting confusion, and I'm not going to refute it today. I mean, there are different versions of it. It goes through a whole lot of cases. Okay, but so really what you're asking is, well, what are the foundations of the axiology?
Or would you say that can those foundations derive from utilitarian grounds?
Can they what?
Can they derive from utilitarian grounds?
Yeah, I don't think they can. That is, unless utilitarianism becomes trivialized to the point that, for example, dignity and moral value are themselves utilitarian considerations. And of course, what we're trying to do is explain such things as moral value. Okay, I don't want this to I don't want it to degenerate into a course in ethics, but you see some of the issues that are involved here. All right, so now let's go ahead. I've got up to these three sources of confusion, and these are quite pervasive, actually. The idea that if the utilitarian consideration can overcome a deontic right, then it follows that the deontic right was really utilitarian to start with. There is a mistake that is absolutely pervasive among professional intellectuals who ought to know better, and it goes as follows. If you have a right to do something, then it's all right to do it. I was aware of this when I had a debate in the New York Review in the old days about, well, it was in the 90s, which was another dreadful era. And somebody was arguing, well, I have a right to propagandize my students in my class to try to convince them of my political opinions, to use the classroom for propaganda purposes. Why? Because I have a right to academic freedom. And the fact that I have a right to do it means it's okay to do it. But of course, that doesn't follow. There are all kinds of things that I have a right to do, which would be stupid or immoral or rude or tasteless to do. So the fact that I have a right to say things that are stupid or false or lying or insincere, I do have a right to say those things. We couldn't have a law against them. Doesn't mean that it's okay to do those things. So there are lots of things that you have a right to do that are not right to do. And this is just a pun. It's a bad pun to say, if I have a right to do it, then it's right to do it. That doesn't follow. Now, why is that? Why is it that we don't make rights match what it's okay to do? And the answer is, society is only going to function if you have a level of power, if you have a set of deontic powers that exceed what is really permissible or acceptable for you to exercise. As a professor in this university, I have all kinds of powers of free expression and so on that it would be really absurd or immoral or ridiculous for me to exercise. But the institution will only work if you give people authority that vastly exceeds what it's reasonable for them to exercise. It's just a mistake to suppose that anything you have a right to do, it's okay to do. You'd be surprised how often people make that mistake. But in the New York Review of Books, I reviewed some guy's book, and I attacked him for saying that it's okay for him to proselytize his students for his political views. He thought, well, you know, my students are subject to all kinds of horrible influences in the community at large. Why don't I use the classroom to tell them the political truth, to tell them the morally valid truth? And when I pointed out that that's violating the principles of his intellectual obligations, he wrote back and said, but free speech, my academic freedom gives me the right to do this, so it's okay to do it. And that's a fallacy, that right implies right. I have a right to do it means it's right to do it. That doesn't follow. Finally, there's another mistake which is rare, but it's made by such a good philosopher as Rawls, that says in cases where the rights are overcome, where the rights, obligations, and so on are overcome, then you have to change your conception of the right, or your obligation. If I have an obligation to keep a promise and I discover a circumstance in which that obligation is overridden, then that alters my conception of promising. Then I have a different definition of promising. And I want to say that's a mistake too. The definition of promising remains constant, but it does have this ceteris paribus condition, and you always have to look. You have to look at the actual circumstance, at the actual conditions under which the right is being invoked. Okay, now we're going to go on and talk about why socialism failed. We solved the question of human rights today. Now let's discuss socialism. Is that okay? Anybody want to say anything more about rights? I tried to finish rights last time, but these points I think are worth going over because basically there are mistakes that are very common in contemporary intellectual life. All right, now remember, I gave you this wonderful list of the differences between socialism and capitalism, and it sure looks, on the strength of the list, like socialism's winning. I mean, I won't repeat the list. I'm not sure I can. I did it off the top of my head, and I don't remember, but maybe somebody else has got it. But it looks like there's no question that socialism is better. It is just, stable, progressive, egalitarian. It resists the boom and bust. It doesn't have vastly unjust distribution of wealth. So we have to look at our definition of socialism, and we go to G.D.H. Cole's definition, where you get public ownership of the means of production. That's the key. And then the second thing you get is no huge wealth differences. And the third is no huge class differences. And this is more important in England than in the United States. And then finally, our fourth part of the definition is everybody has to contribute. And this, everybody contributes to society. You don't have a class of people who form a parasitic leisure class who just live off of other people's labor. All right, now why didn't it work? Well, let's consider some cases where it did work. Let's consider some cases where socialism succeeded. Now let me, first of all, block some cases which people often present to me, which are not socialistic. The favorite example is Sweden. Believe me, Sweden is not a socialist country. I don't know what percentage of the economy is controlled by the government, but basically private ownership is characteristic of the Swedish economy. Even the railways and the utilities are privately owned. So Sweden is hardly a counterexample, and so on with Denmark and Norway. What they are, and that's not the same as socialism, is welfare state capitalism. And they do have successful welfare state capitalism. And they have these two features. There are no huge wealth differences and no huge class differences. Not everybody contributes, but they do. The Scandinavian countries in general have the second and the third. They have a very progressive, a savagely progressive income tax. This is why people in Sweden who suddenly get a whole lot of money move to Monte Carlo. Bjorn Borg, the greatest Swedish tennis player that ever lived, promptly went and lived in the south of France in Monaco. Why? Tax reasons. There's no tax in Monte Carlo, and the taxes in Sweden were prohibitive. He's only going to make money, big money, for a short space of his life, and he wants to keep the money, so he moved. And even Isaac Dinesen moved out of Sweden when she started making. Check this. I don't remember the details of that, but I think she moved out when the money started rolling in. But it basically, what you have in the Scandinavian countries is not socialism, but you have welfare state capitalism, and it's quite successful. Why? Well, several reasons. One is a homogeneous population. What is it? 90% of the population of Sweden are white Lutherans. So the kind of diversity you get in a country like the United States, you just don't get in a country like Sweden. It's uniform in religion, ethnicity, education, and so on. So you don't get the kind of vast differences that you get in bigger countries. And Sweden's the biggest of those countries with almost 10 million people. But when you get to Norway, Denmark, and Finland, the size is about half that or less. You get about 5 million people in each of those countries. Again, you can check this on Google, but I'm giving you approximate figures. Okay, but let's take a socialist society that really is, that really satisfies our definition. It seems to me any university is a socialist society. We have in this university public ownership of the means of production. No professor owns the libraries or the classrooms. It's all publicly owned. There aren't huge wealth differences. On the contrary, it seems to me one of the scandals of academic life is that if you do 10 times as much work as the guy in the office next door, you don't get paid 10 times as much. You'll be lucky if you get paid 50% more, or maybe, well, you won't get 100% more, assuming he's the same seniority, same age, and so on. You still get pretty much. You get some wealth differential, but it's not vast. It isn't like the difference between Bill Gates and his employees, or opposite numbers in a less successful company. So you don't get huge wealth differences. One of the marvelous things about academic life is basically the only class differences are between faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates. That's the only class differences. But within each of those, in the faculty, there's a pretense that we're all equal. And this is annoying to me when it comes to promotion cases, is that in departments where there are a lot of unproductive people, their votes count as much in promoting to tenure as the votes of the productive people. Now, in theory, it's not supposed to be my majority vote. It's in theory, the decision is supposed to be made on the basis of intellectual quality, and the vote of the faculty is just kind of an expression of opinion. But in fact, it is very hard for the administration to overrule a bad decision one way or another made by the faculty. This is the difference between public universities and some of the private universities. Derek Bach, once when he was president of Harvard, told me that any promotion case, any tenure case, takes him about 8 hours of work because he has to read the stuff by the candidate in question. Well, our chancellor doesn't have that kind of time. He simply doesn't have the time to devote 8 hours to every promotion case. So these are made by people who are in various ways have axes to grind, and they're made on the assumption that really we're all equal, that everybody's opinion is of equal value. I think it's a mistake to think that universities are democratic or that they should be democratic. I think ideally the university should be kind of an aristocracy of intellect. But now who gets to decide that? Well, that's a tough one, I agree. But it's a mistake to think that what ought to prevail in university decision making is just the majority vote. Okay, what about everybody contributes? Well, that's the theory in the faculty, is that everybody is supposed to do their part. Everybody's supposed to teach their course and write their books and articles. Now, what actually happens because of tenure is that you get a fair number of people, surprisingly few considering the temptation, you get a fair number of people who, once they get tenure, just quit work. They come to the campus, give their lectures, get their paycheck, and go home. When I taught in Boulder, that seemed to me the characteristic pattern of activity on the part of the faculty. They have very nice houses up in Sunshine Canyon or Boulder Canyon. I grew up in that part of the world. I was born in Denver, so I appreciate the lifestyle that's possible. But a high percentage of the people that I was familiar with at the University of Colorado and Boulder basically just regarded their tenure position as a guaranteed comfortable lifestyle. You can ski several days a week. I appreciated that and took advantage of it when I taught there. But the idea that somehow everybody's desperately engaged in fanatic, intellectual, intense activity, no, that's not the case in a lot of American universities. And I must confess, it's not entirely the case even in Berkeley, though Berkeley is much better than other places that I have taught in this regard. Okay, so I think we have something like a socialist society in American universities, and maybe even, though with this distinction, in the American military. You have a complete ownership of the means of production. All of the weaponry and the trucks and everything else is owned by the government. The pay differentials are probably not as great as or certainly no greater than the pay differentials among faculty members. The class differences are strictly rank. Rank does make an enormous difference in the military, which people in academic life don't recognize. When I told you my son is a lieutenant colonel in the Green Berets, when he walks into a room, he knows immediately whether or not he's the senior officer in that room. Well, I can tell you some funny stories about that. But in any case, so they do have this kind of, they do have the class differences that go with military rank. And it's interesting how revolutionary movements that tried to dispense with the difference between officers and men had to give up on it. That the Soviets in the end had to reinstate the distinction between officers and men. That the military doesn't function effectively without it. But of course, you also have the assumption that everybody contributes. Okay, why did socialism fail then in the countries that I'm familiar with where it failed, notably Britain? Britain made a serious effort to create a socialist society, and they did incredible things. They nationalized a whole lot of the economy, and the efforts that they made to equalize wealth were draconian. The tax rate was the top part of the economic level, at the richest people. The tax rate was 19 6 in the pound, 19 shillings 6 pence in the pound. That is to say, 97.5%. 97.5% of every pound you made, once you got to a certain level, went in taxes. What happened? Well, very simple. The people making a lot of money moved out of the country. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I have a friend whose brothers write plays. They wrote, they're called Schaffer, and they wrote the play about Mozart, Amadeus, and they wrote a whole lot of plays, and they were very successful. Well, guess what? They had to move to New York because there's no point in making this much money because virtually 100%, 97.5% went to the government. So they made a huge effort to overcome that. Now, what did they do about inherited wealth? Well, that was tougher because there are huge wealth differences in Britain. And what they tried to do with that was to have a draconian inheritance tax. Take the money away from the people when their father dies, then take it away. But there were gimmicks to get around that, and one gimmick was if you gave it to your children 7 years before you died, then there was no inheritance tax. So the trick was to calculate how much longer am I going to live and then give it all to the kids before I die. In any case, it didn't work. Why not? Well, it was obvious to me when I moved to Britain that it wasn't working. I had actually worked on a construction crew when I was in high school, and I knew how to build roads. I watched Englishmen go out and build a road. It was an embarrassment. Those guys would not have lasted a day for Stone Construction. That's a company I worked for. I was a member of the Building Construction, Highway Pavers, Sewer and Tunnel Workers Union, local number 113 of the AFL-CIO. And though we were hugely paid, the pay was terrific. That's why I did it. But you had to work, and these guys didn't work. A standard scene in Britain in my childhood was a bunch of workmen sitting down to make tea on a Primus stove. They're supposed to be building a goddamn road. What are they doing? They're lighting a stove to make tea. I'd never seen anything like it. And nobody seemed to mind. This seemed to be perfectly ordinary. If you wanted a telephone, the waiting time was 5 years. If in Oxford, if you applied, I always have a phone. My dad was with a phone company. We had a house full of telephones, 6 phones in our house minimum. Every damn room just about had a phone. And I wanted a phone in Oxford. Waiting time was 6 years to have, some people could get it in 5 years to get a telephone installed. And the awful thing was, people thought this is, that's how it is. It's just the way things are supposed to be. The idea that there's something outrageous about this, well, in any case, it failed. Now, individual people can make a difference to history, and Margaret Thatcher did. Margaret Thatcher pointed out that it was failing. She is hated by people like ourselves, and maybe for good reasons, because she was not in favor of professional intellectuals of the sort that we all exemplify. But she did change England. She did change Britain from a situation in which public ownership produced tremendous stagnation. The economy was, even the British car industries, one of the early industries of Britain, effectively there are no remaining British car firms. The 2 British car firms, Rolls-Royce is owned by BMW, and Jaguar, when I last heard, was owned by the Ford Motor Company. I think Ford tried to dump it, but I don't know if they succeeded or not. But in any case, there are no remaining British car firms, even though British were one of the founders of the automotive industry. Okay, so the short answer why socialism failed was it didn't deliver the goods. Now, this was spectacularly evident in the case of the communist brand of socialism. And I mentioned last time the difference between East Germany and West Germany. The standard line in my childhood was you cannot judge communism by the Soviet Union because Russia was the most backward country in Europe, and it was a terrible place to try to install a socialist economy. But at the end of the Second World War, a wonderful experiment was performed inadvertently. Germany had a unified culture of hard work and technological intelligence. The distinction between East Germany and West Germany during the Cold War was unbelievable. I mean, you just had to walk through Checkpoint Charlie to East Berlin to see how backward and impoverished they were. It's hard to believe that Germans could make a technologically incompetent car, but they did. The Trabant is the worst piece of automotive machinery you can imagine. It had effectively a lawnmower engine of about 150 cc's 2-cycle, and a standard experience you had driving through on the freeways in East Germany, where there are all these Trabis by the roadside with a guy trying to get the thing started again. It's very hard to imagine how the German technology, they had superb technology, how they could produce technologically incompetent products, but they did. And there are amazing success stories in West Germany. How did BMW, for example, which is traditionally a motorcycle maker, at the end of the war they made motorcycles and a few high-performance sports sedans. Now they're a major world-class car producer. So in any case, Germany was a good test case for the difference between a socialist economy and a capitalist economy, though granted that the socialist economy in question was a communist, was an oppressive totalitarian economy. Now, why couldn't they deliver the goods? Well, there are a number of reasons. I told you some last time. The number one priority was always the security of the state. It was never production. It was never prosperity. It was never the benefit of the public. When Soviet businessmen, well, I don't want to say business, when Soviet managers came to the United States to find out how do we do it, the thing they were always astounded by was how much American business people cared about the consumer. They were always, when they met with these guys running General Motors or Colgate, Palmolive, or whatever company they were dealing with, is they cared about what the consumer wanted. Soviet planners never cared about what the consumer wanted. They figured out what we could make and what they thought the public ought to have, but they never gave a damn about what consumers actually desired. Consumer desire did not figure. And basically the problem that these guys had was, most of the Soviet managers who came, is they didn't really believe that they were seeing the real thing. They thought they were being shown certain special, I'll take a question in a second, they're being shown certain special features of the American economy. So my father was an executive of AT&T, and he had to take a Soviet delegation around to show them, this was in New York, to show them typical telephones, crossbar systems, switchboard systems, and so on. And he said that the Soviet guys uniformly believed this can't be widespread. I mean, this telephone that you showed us, okay, so fancy people in New York have it, but you don't get it in, I don't know, St. Louis. Well, yeah, you did. All over the country, they had telephones. And this continues. I had some friends in San Francisco, and they were entertaining some visiting Russians. And they said, well, you can buy fruit, fresh fruit in the stores in Washington and New York, but can you also get fresh fruit in San Francisco? And they said, yeah, you can go to a Safeway now. You know, it's 11 o'clock at night. These Russians didn't believe that. At 11 o'clock at night, you can go buy a banana? Yes. And they took them to a Safeway in San Francisco. This was inconceivable in the socialist camp, that you would get this kind of dedication to consumer welfare. So it may well be that the capitalist economies, for all of their inefficiency, corruption, and injustice, did unleash an enormous amount of creative forces, enormous amount of productive forces, which were simply not present in a socialist economy, whether or not it was the British-style socialist economy, which did allow a certain amount of freedom, or the communist economies where state security became everything and mediocrity was the normal means of running an economy, simply because mediocre people were unthreatening. Okay, I saw various hands, you and then you. Yeah.
So it seems pretty straightforward why freedom to pursue profit would create that kind of concern about
Yeah.
do you think it's in principle impossible to build that into the status function of comrade?
Yeah, I don't know. You see, I am interested in where you get socialist societies that work. And at their best, American universities are socialist societies, because you do have these things. You have very small differences. Now, why do they work? Well, because basically a small percentage is motivated by utilities that are rather subtle, namely the satisfaction of producing a good book. And having it recognized that you've produced a good book, even if you get lousy reviews in journals that ought to know better than producing lousy reviews. So there are all these grounds for motivation that go beyond the standard motivation in a capitalist economy. See, when I was an undergraduate, I used to think, well, the problem with capitalism really, that it gives its greatest rewards to the second-rate efforts of second-rate people. Now it seems to me the great genius of capitalism is it gives its greatest rewards to the second-rate efforts of second-rate people. How capitalism has changed. Now, what I mean by that is this, that producing a more flavorful brand of toothpaste does not seem to me a great achievement. But it may well be that there are all kinds of rewards that go to that, that provide for, if you extend that across the economy, provide for all sorts of advantages in the economy, all sorts of benefits in the economy, even though I don't regard these as, I mean, I don't regard, let us say, to take more spectacular cases, I don't regard Facebook as a great cultural achievement. I do not feel our lives are wonderfully enhanced by Facebook. Every time I look at my friends who are on, I am not on Facebook, though if you Google my name, whatever, I don't know, a verb, if you Facebook my name, you'll find odd occurrences of it, because apparently the name occurs on other people's things. What explains it? Well, one thing that explains it is this. Young people always have a persistent doubt. They doubt that they exist. And this is why the high schools are people with purple hair and goofy tattoos and all kinds of things, because you clearly exist if other people stare at you on the street because of your purple hair or your vast tattoo collection that you've got in various visible parts of your skin. Now, what Facebook has done, it's a stroke of genius, is make it clear that you exist, because there you are. You're on the web. If somebody doubts that you exist, come and see my Facebook page. It is a stroke of genius, and I concede that. I'm not sure that it's a benefit, and now somebody ought to do this, but it hasn't been done, and that is somebody ought to figure out what is the long-term effect of the current forms of digital media on the young human brain. There are some girl I read about in the New York Times, I'm not sure I believe it, who does 27,000 text messages a month. Well, that's what she claims. I want to know the effect on her brain of this. Be careful, always beware of the older generation who tell you how awful the younger generation is. The older generation has been saying that for 2,500 years at least. But maybe there has been a decline in your generation's ability to construct English sentences of a coherent kind. You're going to have a chance on the final exam to prove me wrong. I detect the restlessness among the troops here. Are we run out of time? Oh gosh, and I didn't get started telling you why socialism failed. Well, we got off to a good start. Okay, now we're going to meet next week, and come with the questions that I handed out, and be prepared to discuss them. Think about which questions you'd like me to discuss in class, and I'll tell you a plan for the final exam.